the purpose of today's forum is just to really have a discussion about the language that we use and how it's changing and what we can do better. Because I think it's fair to say that translators, interpreters, language professionals do want to do the right thing. Sometimes we don't know what the right thing is. Sometimes we have to put a bit of effort, a bit of work into educating ourselves. So really the session today is for that purpose. What I'm going to do now is hand over to Chetan Spicer, who works at Polaron as a project, she manages translations project, interpreting projects. But in addition to that, last year she has graduated from translating and interpreting course. So over to you, Chetan.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So today I'm going to be talking about a few points. Firstly, how language has changed over time with regards to talking about people with a disability. I'm going to talk about my personal experience of volunteering with an organisation called Friendship Circle and the lingo used. I'm going to discuss some of my observations of the language used at the recent Paralympic Games. I'm going to give an example of what happens to the language of disability when it gets translated. And lastly, I'm going to make reference to an appearance activist and speaker, Australian, titled Carly Finlay, and some of her pivotal words. Okay, so to start, how language has changed over time when we discuss people with a disability. My points have been inspired from an article by Glenda Watson-Hyatt titled "What is in a Word? The Evolution of Disability Language." So throughout history, culture has unfortunately dismissed and discarded those regarded as different or disabled. Society used terms such as invalid, which literally means not valid or not acceptable. As well, the term handicap conjures the image of someone on a street corner begging for handouts and charity. Such labels degrade these individuals by focusing on their difference or incapability rather than on their individuality. Until recently, the medical model of disability has been the prevalent one, regarding the disabled person as the problem, whereby they are to be adapted to fit into the world as it is. Within this model, common terms used are confined to a wheelchair, housebound, stricken with, and so forth. The focus has unfortunately been on the impairment rather than on the needs of the individual. This language emphasizes dependency, pity, and patronizing attitudes. Thankfully, in the late 1980s, largely influenced by people with disabilities arguing that disability is in fact a social construct and society itself creates the disability, there was a move from the medical to the social model. Within this social model, prejudice, discrimination, and inaccessible environments are regarded as the disabling factors, rather than the medical conditions themselves. This social model highlights the use of language to disempower and employed as a means of control, domination, and subtle or blatant discrimination. This model engendered the empowerment of people with disabilities through the development of a disabled identity and self-advocacy movements. After this, the language around disability began to change. For the first time in history, people with disabilities were finding their voice in determining which terms would define them. This resulted in a widespread social realization that the disabled population is not a homogeneous group, rather a group of individuals often lumped together despite differences in experiences, beliefs, and goals.
Good morning, how are you?
Hello. Society grappled for more socially acceptable terminology, such as physically challenged, visually impaired, differently abled, disabled. Although the terms used in reference to people with disabilities are certainly evolving, the language employed in describing their experiences is still somewhat medicalized. For example, able-bodied individuals exercise and have fitness trainers, while individuals with disabilities get rehab and have physiotherapists. Such language still implies a sense of dependency and inferiority. a sense that the experiences are happening to the individual rather than the individual being actively involved. Ultimately, words can hurt or heal, they can disempower or empower. It is therefore essential to consider the language you use in your day-to-day. As a way to empower your words, here are some tips. Put people first, not their disability. Andrea, I think you might want to go to the next slide.
Sure.
Yeah, individuals with disabilities may have preferences for how they want to be referred to. Simply ask. If a particular situation does not require disability-related terminology, simply use their names. The key, after all, is to speak and refer to all people in a respectful manner. Okay, and on to the next slide. So back in 2016, I volunteered sporadically for an organisation based in Melbourne called the Friendship Circle. This organisation is targeted at individuals with special needs, as well as their family members. They offer programs such as school holiday, day camp, Sunday circle, morning respite, home visitation programs, buddy programs, weekend retreats, and so forth, with activities and excursions such as art and crafts, bowling, puppet making. When I volunteered there, I would be assigned a buddy who I would look after and do activities with throughout the day. Interestingly enough, we were instructed by the coordinators to use the term individuals, kids, adults with special needs, and were told that this was the most socially and politically correct terminology to use. This certainly does contrast with other terminologies, so it's clear that it does vary depending on the organisation.
Thank you.
Moving on, so some of my observations of the language used at the recent 2021 Paralympic Games. So the Paralympic Committee have made a concerted effort to establish and inform the public of the correct terminology to use when referencing the participating athletes and relevant categories. It is really important to use the correct terminology to show respect and thoughtfulness to the participants. The International Paralympic Committee, or IPC, defines the term parasport to mean any sport in which people with a disability participate and which has classification rules compliant with the IPC Athlete Classification Code. During the Games, the term Paralympic sport is used, whilst terms like disabled sport and disability sport have been deemed incorrect by the IPC. They have even distinguished between a Paralympian, being an athlete with a disability who has competed at the Paralympic Games, and a para-athlete, an athlete with a disability who competes in disability events. Paralympic guides outline and emphasise how words like cripple, handicap, invalid, and impaired all have deeply negative connotations in the English language and should not be used. Furthermore, when discussing disability, these guides advocate the use of the term has rather than suffers from. Okay, and on to the next slide. So here we can see so I put together this table based off a guide that I found online. So it's the terms disabled and accessible, translated from English into Spanish, Italian, and French, numbered 1, 2, 3. And then back translated from those languages back into English. So we can see from the table that when translating language of disability into those languages, there are certainly terms which do have a direct equivalent, such as accessible. However, when back translating from those languages, we can see that there are some negative connotations for the English word disabled, such as the terms incapacity, handicapped, and cripple. These are obviously derogatory terms to describe someone living with a disability. So it begs the question whether, some foreign languages still have a way to go and progress needs to be made in terms of finding more acceptable terminology. Okay, and on to my final slide. Okay, so several years ago, I took a bioethics subject as part of my undergraduate degree at Melbourne University. We had the privilege of having some lectures presented by Carly Finlay. She is an Australian writer, speaker, and online lecturer. She describes herself as an appearance activist and has been outspoken on a number of disability-related issues. With regards to the language of disability, she co-wrote an article titled Ally Etiquette, the disability terms everyone should know. She discusses how language is a powerful tool that has been politicized and has the power to influence how we perceive our fellow Australians, as well as having a direct impact on those at the centre of the conversation. The People with Disability Australia's language guide states that people living with a disability are often described in disempowering, discriminatory, degrading, and offensive ways. Negative words such as victim or sufferer reinforce stereotypes that people with disability are unhappy, wish they were normal, and should be pitied. To counter this, Carly put together a guide of terms to help the public broaden their perspective and increase their understanding of disability. In terms of preferred language, Carly emphasises the importance of honouring and respecting how an individual disabled person wishes to be addressed is crucial, as within the community, there are ultimately varying preferences. The social model of disability states that the barriers faced are not about the individuals, but are about the world. The problem with being disabled is not about their impairments, but rather about the attitudes, access, expenses, discrimination, and violence which they sometimes experience in the world. As a final statement, the fight for disability rights is about these individuals having more power over their own decision making, which includes their right to call themselves by their preferred language. For some, it is person with disability. For others, it's disabled person. The disability community is not homogenous. One person's preference might not be the same for another. When in doubt, ask. And here is a table with some examples from Carly's guide. Okay, well, thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and I'll now hand it back over to Eva.
We did, Chaichum, so thank you for that. And we're going to get into the discussion proper, but we already had quite a few comments, so I'm very excited about that. And thanks everyone, and keep contributing. We'll go back to your comments and queries and questions in a moment. I did want to frame the discussion too by just saying that back in 2015, there were 4.3 million people in Australia, or that's as many as 18% with some level of disability. And around 23% of those are of culturally and linguistically diverse background. And we know also, which is documented and well researched, that people with disability from non-English speaking backgrounds are accessing disability services up to 2/3 less than Australian-born people. And that is despite having similar rates of disability. So thank you, Chaichum, for framing, the conversation and giving us some examples of what happens out there in the real, world. But let's move on to our panel discussion. And we prepared a couple of questions for Hannah and Karen, and I would invite you both to please contribute to this. And some of it is pretty obvious, but why do we need to be respectful and conscious of the language we use when we discuss disability, portray disability, and address people with disability? I'll start with Hannah, please.
Hi guys, I'm Hannah. Listen, before I go any further, I think it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge that I am currently coming to you from Darawal land, the land of the Darawal people of the Eora nation, land that was never ceded and that exists without sovereignty, I guess. So I want to start with a really a kind of simple answer to the question, which is you need to be conscious of the language you use when you discuss disability, because people with disabilities are human too, and like you want to make sure that you're not being hurtful, or that you're not assuming that we are less capable or any of those sorts of things. Kind of building on Tatum's presentation, just so everyone knows, I actually don't mind being called a disabled person first, because to me, being disabled is not just a fact of my life, it's actually part of my identity. And I was kind of having this discussion in the comments before. Someone was saying that everyone has a disability, when disability literally means not being able to do something. And while that's obviously the literal translation of the word, not everybody experiences the financial, social, cultural kind of barriers and psychological and physical kind of, I guess, kind of weight that comes with being a disabled person. Disabled people are marginalized. We're the biggest marginalized group in the world. I know Andrea and Eva gave you some stats earlier, but like if you look globally, there's 1 billion people who are disabled. And I think while it's wonderful to be looking at this from a language point of view, the best way to learn is to actively involve disabled people. And you've also got to remember that for many disabled people, there are different ways for language to exist. So there's Auslan, or cultural equivalents of sign language. There's other speech and communication technologies that allow people with disabilities to articulate and communicate with the world. And I think we've also got to acknowledge that as much as anything else. Karen, I'm conscious I've taken up a lot of time answering this question, so please jump in.
Thanks, Hannah. Lots of very, very good points. And one of them is that disability is a natural part of human existence, of course. So it's, I guess, what, just summarizing what you said, it would be difficult at every step of every day to think about, I guess needing to explain to everybody about why some words might be hurtful, or why, why something sounds unright to say. Over to you, Karen. How would you like to contribute to this question? Why do we need to be conscious of the language?
I think the biggest reason that we need to be conscious of it is because of the history. So, and I'm pretty sure Hannah and Tatum both mentioned this, but there's been a history of people with disabilities being marginalised, being locked away from other people, being segregated, and just not valued, basically. And so I think that the move to change the language that we use has been a really strong tool to actually change the way that we think about people with disabilities, so that we have a much more positive kind of opinion and experiences of disability. I'm similar. I identify as a disabled woman, and the reason that I do that is because of the social model of disability. So I believe that I could do anything if there weren't barriers in my way in society. So there are things that are out in society that prevent me being able to live a life the same as other people. Sorry, I've forgotten where I was going to go next. One of the parts of my disability is that I do actually have some cognitive disabilities, which mean that I do forget things quite often and forget where I'm up to. But I think there has been the change in language that we've been talking about from people with disabilities, and that's still the preferred term in, I guess, what you'd call the disability sector. So it's considered politically correct. But there's definitely a move over to disabled people. And I think Australia is kind of moving toward that being mainstream, but we're not quite there yet. And that it is really important to use the language that an individual wants to have used, but also the language that is kind of generally accepted. That can depend as well on who is actually using the language. So if you are someone with disability, then you might, I talk about disabled people and autistic people and that kind of thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that a group or an organisation or a person who doesn't have disability can speak that way.
Yeah. I was just going to add that I think there's a difference between the disability sector and the disabled community. There can be crossover where members of the disabled community obviously work in the disability sector, but I think sometimes the disability sector is still sort of learning that, like, while they are, I guess, what I like to call disability adjacent, in that they have experience being a carer or being a medical professional or whatever it might be. I think language is moving towards prioritizing lived experience of disability, which I think is really important and really powerful, and it should be up to the disabled community itself to shape how we are kind of referred to and identified.
And to define it. Very interesting points. I mean, every now and then, as I mentioned earlier, I still work as a translator. My language pairs Polish and English, and every now and then I'll see something written for people with disability in Polish, and they use words like suffering from. And I just cringe because we've had so much education here in Australia to understand that it's not, nobody's suffering from anything. It's but I've seen a term living with disability thrown around quite a bit. Is that a preferred term or not a preferred term, living with disability?
Hannah, do you mind if I jump in on that one?
Yeah, sure, go
Go
ahead.
for it.
So I think living with disability started in the disability community, so with people who are disabled, but it got co-opted by people in the disability sector. And so to say that my family member has disability, my neighbour has disability, then that became living with disability or lived experience of disability. And so it has kind of changed its meaning. And I think most of us who have disabilities, we don't use that term anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That's my experience too.
Yeah, the language is very nuanced and it's ever changing. And I think, the challenge is to use the right words and do the right things, but we sometimes don't know what it is. And it can lead to exclusion or even people feeling, offended. Let's move on to the next question, Andrea, if we may, which is about inclusive language. So does one of you want to have a go at explaining what inclusive language is and how do we use it to overcome some of the barriers that you've discussed? Karen, I'll get you to speak first, if that's okay.
Yep, sure. So being inclusive is including everyone, not necessarily in the same way because people do have different needs, but making sure that everyone can be included. The other term that I would use for that is accessible. So you might have heard about accessibility in terms of having ramps and having lifts and having like braille and on the numbers in the lifts and that kind of thing. But I really use accessibility far more broadly. So it's about what are those barriers that stop you from being part of it. And this is just as important in language. And in fact, I work mostly with what I call disability communication. And that's, just the ways that we communicate people, whether it's social media policies or whatever, in a way that we're capturing as many people as possible and they understand what you're trying to say. So to me, inclusive language is about using that kind of accepted politically correct language, but it's also about looking about using language that everyone can understand. And there's a stat that I've found where I'm pretty sure it's something like 67% of Australians can only read at a fairly basic primary school level. And so there's a lot of people out there that can't read what we call big words. You know, they can't read complex text. And so whether we're speaking, whether we're writing, I think bringing it back down to as simple as we can, it just helps everyone, and it includes everyone.
Yeah. And before I hand over to Hannah, I was going to pick up on another point that you both mentioned, actually, which I find really fascinating, and that is the difference between the disability sector and their point of view, I guess, and also the disabled community or community of people with disabilities. What's that about? I'm very interested to hear that that you've made that distinction.
I think, and I should start by saying that I started out in the disability sector, so I've actually acquired my disabilities. I've been working in the disability sector my entire career, though, so it's been an interesting kind of travel for me. But it really is to distinguish the difference. And I think it's about people with disabilities owning their disabilities. So you'll find now, if you're listening to kind of disability advocates and people who are out there, a lot of them are proud to be disabled. They might not be best friends with their disability as such, but they know, you know, they are proud of the way that they communicate, the way that they work, the speaking up that they do. And so I guess the disability sector can do that. I think what Hannah said was adjacent to us, but we really don't want them doing that for us wherever possible, because that should be coming from us.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. And I was actually going to say, unlike Karen, I have a very different experience in that I was born with my disability. I have cerebral palsy, which is a lifelong condition. So basically, obviously being disabled is the only thing I've known my entire life. And the amount of times where I would be present at like therapy appointments or medical things or whatever, and people would talk about me as though I wasn't in the room, or kind of have the language that they understood me, but they weren't ever talking to me. That's kind of how I distinguish between the disability sector and the disabled community. Not that there can't be crossover between the two, and the disability sector is doing better than it used to, but I think it's still people's kind of natural instinct to not be inclusive in like the sense that they're not bringing people in to the conversation. So like if you're a medical professional and you're treating a child with disability, when you have the big conversation and use the big medical words with their parents, please do like a kind of translated version so that the kids can understand what's going on, because then the poor parents aren't left to deal with their very curious kids' questions like mine were, where they're like, we don't know because we're not the professionals, but like nobody explained it to us. And the other thing I would say about inclusive language is it's also making accommodations for language. So whether that's if you're posting a video on social media, put captions on. If you're having something for your business, maybe investigate using Auslan or some other form of sign language. If you're posting a photo on Instagram, put an image description where basically you just describe what's going on in the image so that people who are blind and use screen readers can still interact with your content. So it's also stuff like that where language can be helpful and inclusive in other ways.
So we can all do better, I think, and I think with the use of technology, as we getting better at developing aids, I guess, to support our needs, we should all do better. But why do you think, Hannah? What is it that those medical specialists, when they were talking about you, they were not talking to you? What is it about? Is it because they were in a position of power, or why would they not talk to you directly, do you think?
I mean, there's probably an element of me being a child and them wanting to talk to my parents who were the other adults. But there's also an element of like not realizing that like we're figuring it out just as much. And like, especially when you're a kid, you're still working out what your body can do, what your body can't do, what fatigue feels like, what pain feels like, so for me, obviously cerebral palsy is a lifelong condition, but for me when I was like 5 years old, forever could have been a week. Like my sense of time has obviously changed as I've gotten older. And I think also people don't realize that like we have to actually live with the condition. Like the point is not to suffer from, like you were saying before, but we have to actually be able to build a life with this thing kind of firmly in tow, or with our disability shaping our identity. And in order to be able to do that, we have to feel like we're actively being included, because eventually for many of us, we're going to have to advocate for ourselves. And if we don't know how to do that, if the examples that we've seen, or if our parents speak other languages or that kind of thing, how are we supposed to advocate? I mean, it's the same as if you were having a conversation with someone in another language and you needed a translator to be able to communicate. Translation can exist on several different levels. It doesn't have to be from one language to another. It could be from complex language into simplified terms, or whatever you like, really.
So it's all about empowerment, I guess. And Hannah and Karen, what are the hallmarks of inclusive language? You have already mentioned simplicity and trying to use words that everybody can understand. Any other tips you could give us about how to make language more inclusive?
Sorry, I'm happy to talk to that.
Go for it.
Before I start with this, I did just want to say a lot of people think this is very hard. I'm going to get it wrong, so I don't know where to start, so I'm not going to do it. But I just want to throw it out that actually it can be quite simple, and that disabled people are not going to have a problem with you getting it wrong if you are happy to be corrected and then change what you're saying and learn from that experience. So just putting that out there. There are some phrases that are used that are particularly difficult for us to hear, and the reason for that is because they don't show value for the person. They're when you were talking, Hannah, about how the doctor wouldn't talk to you, the term I would use for that is paternalistic. So it's that kind of the experts, they know it all, they're the most important ones, kind of speaking down. And that was happening for a lot of different groups. It is changing, thank goodness. But yes, it's really been a case of people wouldn't know what to do with that information. They wouldn't understand that information, or in the past they didn't get the right to make a choice about it anyway. But there's a few terms that I wanted to talk about, and there are some fantastic guides to language about disability that are out on the internet. The one that I would recommend the highest at this point is the one by People with Disabilities Australia, and I think Tatum mentioned that one. And the reason that I suggest that the highest is that A, it was only written last year, and B, it was written by a disability organisation. Like that organisation is almost completely, I think, people with disabilities. So you're getting it from, the experts. I wanted to talk about the use of vulnerable. So I think vulnerable is one of those terms that became very popular a few years ago. And the reason that that is really problematic for people with disabilities, and in particular, women with disabilities and other kind of groups within the disability community, is that it doesn't follow the social model. So what it says is that we are vulnerable, we can't look after ourselves. So if something happens to us, that was actually because we couldn't do the right thing or we didn't do the right thing. So what we like to use is at risk, because at risk means that it's coming from outside. That threat is coming from outside, not from our disability and not from what we're doing. I did definitely want to talk about special needs, and I noticed there has been a little bit of conversation about it in the chat. Special needs, no, never, ever. Let's not talk about special. I'm not special. I don't know about Hannah. Maybe she is special, but
No.
you know, I don't feel I'm special. My kids with autism aren't special. It's really patronising. So yeah, we don't go there. Let's get rid of special needs altogether. Special education, anything special. We are just disabled people, people with disability. And I think that was, oh, and the other thing I wanted to talk about was with regard to the Paralympian and the language used by the Paralympics, and even if you're looking at the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, that we need to keep in mind that that language is international, and it's probably more important for translators to realise that that language that they're using isn't always the best practice language to use here in Australia. So it's good to kind of know and see what they're saying, but it's not necessarily the language that is acceptable here. So just wanted to throw that out there, and that you better to have a look at that resource that I know the link was put in the chat, and start from there.
Thank you, Karen. We have one more question, and then we're going to open up for discussion. This is a question, at the moment it's just for Tatum, and we'll open that up to everybody, because we do have quite a few translators and interpreters in the room, virtual room. Tatum, how do we translate disability? You showed us a few examples of what can happen if things are translated literally or without the context or without the, I guess, the education that here in Australia we have had about, you know, what are the more culturally appropriate terms to use. What tips could you give us about translating disability? It's a very big topic.
Yeah, so I think, as you said, context is really important. So making sure that you fully understand what the text is about, so that you can then find the most appropriate word. If you have the opportunity to speak to the author or the person who produced the text and find out, you know, what is the most appropriate term to use, I think that could be a good solution. You know, doing your own research and finding out, you know, based on the context of the text, what is the most appropriate terminology to use with regards to that particular, whether it's a character or the person being referenced in the text. Those would be some tips of mine. I think, yeah, context, and where you can speak to the author, speak to the writer of the text, do your own research, you know, don't be thoughtful about the linguistic choice you make.
Thank you.
Eva, are you maybe on mute?
I think we've lost Eva for a sec. Are you still there, Eva? Yeah, I think Eva can't hear us. Thank you so much, Tatum, for your answer. I'm not sure if Hannah and Karen wants to contribute to this question.
Yep, sure, I'm happy to.
Thank you.
When I was thinking about this in the context of translating And it's not just translating between other languages, you're translating between cultures, and every culture has a different understanding of disability. There are cultures where disability is not even acknowledged because people are so included that they're just like everyone else. But there are other cultures where people with disability are very separate, very different. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the understanding that and know about, recognise and acknowledge the understanding of disability that particular cultural group has, because I think coming in and just saying, well, no, this is how disability is really a bit presumptuous, and they might not even have the first idea about what you're talking about. So I think kind of role modelling, but also translating then. You know, we were talking about translating those really complex words. Well, we're talking about receiving therapies, and this is what that means, you know, to you. So it's almost translating the ideas into to help them make the change as well, you know, rather than just that straight translation like Tatum was showing us. Yeah.
And I think it's also important to point out that Karen and I are obviously both white women who speak English as a first language. So our experience of disability still comes with a lot of layers of privilege because of the color of our skin, because of the language that we speak most fluently. So I think obviously we can't be the experts on how disability is like transposed and translated culturally and different things. I think if you want to do that, there has to be lots of research and platforming given to people of color who are also disabled, or people from other cultures, because like Karen said, you have cultures where disability is not even thought of as an issue, all the way to cultures where disability is almost demonized and thought to be kind of some sort of punishment. So I think, and Australia sits somewhere in the middle, kind of, I think. But yeah, just remember that obviously our perspectives aren't the only perspectives, and if you really want to learn about that stuff, it's probably important that you actively seek out diverse perspectives as well.
Right, and I think for translators and interpreters, we always need to bear in mind that we're translating for Australians. They might, you know, they happen maybe to speak another language, but we need to be conscious of the language that we use here. And sometimes we apply this method that's called transcreation, where in fact in the other language the direct equivalent may not exist. So we have to come up with an equivalent that works for Australian audiences. I remember years ago when we were talking about dementia, that was, you know, kind of quite new. It had connotations of madness or, you know, mental disease. And we had to work with, you know, within different communities of finding just the right word so that people could relate to it here in Australia. So I think the other point I wanted to make there is that we need to research, we need to read, we need to be across, you know, what's happening in the language in English, and then, you know, translate it in a way that's appropriate and sensitively, and, you know, correct, essentially, in many other languages, whereby, as Hannah pointed out, they may not exist, or the concept of disability might be completely different to what we are used to. So what I'd like to do now is, Andrea, open the floor up for discussion. There's been a few questions and some excellent comments. Thank you, everybody, for your contributions, particularly for resources that I've seen sort of flying past. We'll send them as a summary of this session. So I invite everyone to, through Andrea, to ask questions now. Andrea, over to you.
Thank you, Eva. I just wanted to remind everyone that you can just click on the chat section and just pop up your question there, and we will answer your question shortly. So the first question I have here, someone asked, the word disability is a medical term from the medical model. How about just a person with a condition?
Okay, Hannah, what do you think? A person with a condition, is that a better way to describe something?
I would say not quite. And it's funny because I almost can't really articulate why, but I think people can have all sorts of, I don't know, maybe condition is more temporary in my head. Or maybe it's because I know that there are some medical conditions here in Australia that don't lead to your whole life being impacted, in terms of like being a disabled person carries with it financial barriers, it carries psychological and physical barriers, it carries social barriers, it carries safety barriers, like all of these other bits and pieces. So I'm not quite sure that condition is the right word, but I think I agree with the comment here where it says majority of the time when the word condition is used, it means a problem or sickness. I don't know if Karen wants to expand on that, but yeah, that's how I feel.
Thank you, Hannah. Karen, did you want to contribute to this?
Yeah, I would say it comes back to that social model of disability. For myself, I have a number of autoimmune conditions. Have those conditions, they affect my body in ways that mean that I am disabled by society. So the conditions cause my body to work in not the same way as everyone else, but then I'm disabled by not being able to get out and participate in society the same way. So it's really about where that kind of comes from, where the disability comes from. And I think I did say before, a lot of people are proud to kind of own that disabled label. I think probably most of the disability community prefers the term disabled over anything else that's out there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Karen. In some languages, when translated, disability directly translated back into English means unable to do some things. Like it's more descriptive, and I think it's kind of more balanced. Where I think disability in English has got this finality to it that some other languages do not have. So some of the languages I speak, like I said, they have. Like a more descriptive model of what it means. So then when it's translated into English, it's less harsh maybe when used or something like that. Andrea, any other questions?
Yes, just going back to Titan's presentation regarding Paralympic Games, there's someone asking, why don't we use just the word or the term athlete when we talk about someone with a disability in the sports field?
Karen, what do you think?
Oh, sorry.
Yes, I agree. That's all I have to say.
And I think part of that distinction comes down to people's perception of Paralympic athletes. There seems to be this weird thing, and I've dealt with it a bit, where there's kind of a weird assumption where people think that every disabled person has the potential to be a Paralympic athlete. And number one, not all disabled people want to be Paralympic athletes, surprise, surprise. But number two, I think it's also super important to point out that like a Paralympian, in the same way that an Olympian is an elite athlete. They are training hard, they are putting their blood, sweat, and tears into their sport. And it's not the kind of thing that, like, I guess, excuse the pun, that any disabled person could roll up and just casually win an Olympic gold medal. Like, there has to be a lot of work involved, and I think maybe that's why the distinction is made sometimes subconsciously too. Not even I don't even think they're aware of it.
Okay. We had so much fun that we've not even realized that we're about to run out of time. So we've been talking for an hour, but I personally, and I'm sure that everybody else that has attended, I found it really enlightening. And I am just so grateful to you two for coming and telling us like it is. I think I really appreciated your points of view and contribution, and just explaining some of the basic things that we should all consider. I wanted to thank you both and hand over to you, Karen, and then to Hannah, just for last few words of a summary. Karen, anything else that you want to say? You have about 30 seconds, if that's okay.
I did. I just wanted to mention the NDRP, which is the National Disability Research Partnership, who I am working with. There is actually quite a bit of research that's on their website that is related to language, and some of the funded projects at the moment are specifically about communication with various other languages and other cultures. So go and have a look at that. You'll find some interesting information. Sorry, I'm at my parents' place. But thank you all so much. It's been really great. Yeah.
Fantastic. And Hannah, last but not least, say a few words to see us out of the session, and thank you so much for your participation too.
Thank you so much for having me, first of all. And I think the number one thing I would say is, wherever you can, defer to the person with the disability above all else. If you're not sure, ask.
Excuse me. Hello. Hello?
Yes.
Can we receive the recording of this 1 hour seminar, please?
Yes, absolutely. We're gonna be popping this video on our YouTube channel, and we're gonna send this recording to everyone.
And also, do we receive 10 point for this seminar or not?
Yes, just email me and I'll give you more information about it. Thank you.
What I have to email?
All right. Well, on that note, thanks. On that note, thank you so much, everyone, especially Hannah and Karen and Clayton for your contribution. We will be captioning this session and making it available on our YouTube channel. Thanks, everyone, for participating.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. I think we're done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.